David begins a new life. Part 1. My journey to Dover was a very difficult one. I was robbed almost as soon as I had left the house. I had no place to sleep, and at times I slept in haystacks that lay in deserted barns. I encountered dangers of all kinds. I got a 6-mile ride in a cart, and I walked the rest of the way to my aunt Miss Betsy's house. My shoes were in a woeful condition, and my cap was frayed and battered. I looked miserable in my clothes that had been torn and soiled with heat, dew, and grass. While searching for Aunt Betsy's house in Dover, I met her handmaid. She led me to the house where I was destined to find refuge and care. As I entered the garden gate, I saw a bespectacled, perplexed-looking gentleman looking at me from an upstairs window. Simultaneously, a lady appeared at the door. Instantly, I knew that she was Miss Betsy because she walked out of her house just the way my mother had described her usual way of entering ours at Blunderstone. Looking at me, she shouted, "Go away! No boys here!" "If you please, ma'am," I pleaded. She stared at me, wondering who I was. "If you please, aunt, I am your nephew," I repeated softly. Aunt Betsy's reaction was one of great alarm. She staggered back and sat right in the garden path. I continued, "I am David Copperfield of Blunderstone in Suffolk, where you came on the night when I was born and saw my dear mamma. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been humiliated, taught nothing, and put to heavy work. I had no choice but to run away to you." I was telling my aunt about my journey when all at once I broke into tears. I fell on my knees and lay my head on her warm lap. She called out for a gentleman to assist her. As he entered, she said,
"You have heard me mention my nephew, David Copperfield, haven't you?"
Mr. Dick seemed to be perplexed, but Miss Betsy continued to speak.
"Well, this is my nephew, and he has run away. Now what should we do with him?"
Dick suggested that I should immediately be given a bath. The bath took away some pain from my aching limbs. I was clothed in a shirt and a pair of trousers that belonged to Mr. Dick. Then I was covered in 2 great shawls which warmed my body. I fell into a deep sleep and I was woken up at dinner time. The dinner was a treat as I had not tasted good food for long. I narrated my agonizing past to my aunt in as much detail as I possibly could. I was deeply anxious regarding my future, but I chose not to talk of it that night. The next day, I learned that Aunt Betsy had written to my stepfather about my presence in her house. The very thought of my stepfather tracing me and taking me back was agonizing. The days that followed were spent in a state of anxiety. Fortunately, Mr. Dick grew fond of me, and I got to spend some time with him. The memorable moments that I shared with Mr. Dick, whose passion for flying kites was insurmountable, eased my discomfort to some extent. One day, Miss Betsy asked me,
"What do you think of Dick?"
I replied, "He is very nice." Miss Betsy then informed me that Mr. Dick was a distant relative of hers and he was declared insane by his own brother. Miss Betsy had come to his rescue and got him home. I was told that Mr. Dick had been living with her for the past 10 years. On hearing about this, my affection for my aunt increased manifold. The next day, Mr. Murdstone rode into the gate with his sister, Miss Murdstone. Miss Betsy first reproached Miss Murdstone for allowing her donkey to trample the edge of her lawn. Then she called for me to meet the visitors. Mr. Murdstone expressed his great displeasure regarding my behavior. He said,
"This boy has caused much trouble in the past. He has a rebellious spirit and a violent temper. We have tried to correct his vices, but all in vain."
In turn, my aunt asked,
If he had been your own boy, would you have beaten him and sent him off to a house in London at such a tender age?
Miss Murdstone replied sharply,
If he had been my brother's own son, his character would have been very different.
Mr. Murdstone added that he would take me back and dispose of me as he thought right. My aunt simply informed the two visitors that she had no intention of sending me back with them. Instead, she had decided to be my guardian. Before Mr. Murdstone and Miss Murdstone left, Miss Betsy said,
Good day, sir, and goodbye.
Looking at Miss Murdstone, she exclaimed,
And good day to you, ma'am. Let me see you ride a donkey over my green again, and I'll knock your bonnet off and tread upon it.
Once the Murdstones had left, my aunt turned to Mr. Dick and said,
Will you consider being David's guardian jointly with me?
Mr. Dick smilingly replied,
"I shall be delighted to be the guardian of such a bright young man."
With a deep sigh, my aunt said,
Then that's well settled.
I was so happy that I hugged my aunt and kissed her many times. I shook hands with Mr. Dick repeatedly